This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, here to kick things off for this week's episode. Today, Chandler Fritz, author of Harper's magazine's cover story, The Homemade Scholar, joins us to share what he found when he stepped inside an ESA-funded micro school, including a bad curriculum, but joyful children. Then, on the Research Minute, Adam Tyner looks at California's big spending surge on schools and why it hasn't raised teacher pay. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now please join me in welcoming today's special guest, Chandler Fritz. Chandler, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be with both of you. I'm excited to talk about the piece.
Yeah, well, speaking of both of us, let me also welcome, as always, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Chandler. Always a pleasure.
Well, Chandler is here to talk about what I just told him, and I believe it is one of the best pieces of education writing that I have seen in years. It was a cover story for Harper's magazine called The Homemade Scholar, and it's about a micro school. And not only is it about a micro school, it's about a micro school that Chandler himself taught in. This was a chance for him to be both reporter and teacher at the same time. The result is an incredible portrait of a micro school that gets taxpayer dollars from education savings accounts in Arizona. We're going to talk all about that on Ed Reform Update. So Chandler, our listeners here, they are policy wonks, so they know all about education savings accounts. That piece is not hard. We've talked all the time on this show about the pros and cons of various ways of going about school choice. Listeners know that I'm a big accountability hawk. I'm a big fan of charter schools, especially where we can both make sure on the front end that people who get the charter to run a public school know what they're doing. And if something happens and it turns out they just can't get the job done, that kids aren't learning, we can come in and close down that school if need be. With Arizona's Education Savings Account program, really the exact opposite. Almost no regulation at all. So much of what's been written about these ESAs then has been either sort of polemics from the left or the right? Either they're, the end of public education and, it's nothing but a huge scam, or this is going to be the way that we're going to discover new innovative approaches to education is going to finally revolutionize our schools. I think what I and so many other people I've seen on social media that I've talked to liked about your piece is that it's not at all a polemic. It really is a great narrative about what one of these schools actually looks like. So why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us, kind of give us, for people that haven't read it yet, just give us a picture. What was this micro school in Arizona that you taught in like?
Yeah, well, and thank you again for the really kind words about the piece. It really means the world. The school I taught at was called Refresh Learning Center. It's a school of about 30 students, and it's in a far West Valley suburb of Phoenix. And I wanted to teach at the school in particular because of where it is in Phoenix and how it's situated around other education options. There's a lot of micro schools in Arizona. So micro schools are kind of booming in any state that has ESA. And I wanted to go to one where the families were actively making a choice to enroll their kids in that school, even though there were decent public schools or charter schools or traditional private Christian schools nearby. And that was the case for Refresh. Even though it's far removed from the city center, it was a 10-minute drive from an A-ranked public school. It was a 10-minute drive from a more traditional private Christian school. There was even a charter school within like a 25-minute drive of it. So it told me that the parents actively wanted to be enrolling their kid in this sort of school environment. The school was held in a casita, what we would call it in Phoenix, just a guest house, basically, of this couple, a pastor and wife couple from California who had relocated to Arizona to start a church and then started this school. All the kids meet in one classroom. I taught kids from ages 12 to 17 in one class. And so in that way, it was appealing to me because there's this romantic view of micro schools as a traditional American schoolhouse, right? We're resurrecting that kind of idyllic educational environment. But then there's also kind of this nightmare view, which is this is a bunch of kids who are in a shoddily constructed building where their curriculum is just something cheap that the teachers bought online, and there are no tests. There is no, the state doesn't even know that these kids are going to school every day. There's no attendance records being submitted. So I wanted to go in to get a real picture of, romance versus nightmare. I knew the truth was somewhere in between.
And you depict this school as, like you saying, having some real issues. I mean, you do not like the curriculum. You are concerned. It's clear that the state has so really no information about these kids, as you say, whether they're even attending, much less learning anything. And they're getting taxpayer dollars. That is something that a lot of us would be worried about. On the other hand, you say these kids are really happy. That we hear a lot about joyfulness in education these days. Got to bring the joy back. The school is bringing the joy. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I'm happy you picked up on that. That was the heart of the piece for me. And the hardest thing for me in writing the piece was, how do I reconcile what are to me very real problems with the curriculum with obvious student happiness? And having taught for 5 years before, I taught in charter schools, I taught in private school, fancy private school in New York, I taught in the prison system in Arizona. I knew that happiness and joy in classrooms is in short supply. And it's obvious when you see it too. So the kids' happiness had a lot to do with the fact that, the school was small enough that each of them could recognize their role in the community and their importance, I think, to the classroom. The teachers, of course, did a good job of fostering that sort of environment too. But there's a lot of merit to a small classroom. And there's also a lot to be said for a classroom where it's very easy to control technology access. It's very easy the kids there was a plastic Tupperware container I'd put in the middle of the table. All the kids put their phones in it, and I'd take it away, and that was it. That's all there was to it. So it had a lot to speak for it for capturing that sort of rare thing in education today, which is the joy of learning.
Well, and from your perspective, I mean, let's set aside the prison system you taught in, which, okay, that's a special case. Although I imagine plenty of people out there are thinking, like I am, boy, I worry that might have been too similar to our traditional public schools that can feel like a prison. They sometimes look like a prison. But I mean, what is it that allows for that joyfulness? So it's the small size, control over technology. They see their roles. I mean, some people would say, well, they don't have to do standardized testing. It's the testing that's driving the joy out of schools. I mean, is that true? What have
That's
you seen?
interesting. I don't know if it's necessarily the lack of testing. I think, the pace of the school day and the routine that the kids had were both of those things were very attentive to what I think children need. So, for example, the school day would start every day with chores, and the chores for the kids were mucking the chicken coop, refreshing. They had some desert tortoises in the backyard that they took care of, and the chickens that they took care of, getting the eggs in from the chicken coop.
By the way, Chandler,
Yeah.
can I assume that nobody in this school was vaccinated? Is that?
I don't know. I didn't ask. I probably should have for my own safety. But
I've got this theory that the intersection between the Make America Healthy Again crowd and the micro school crowd, and when you're saying mucking the chicken coop, I can just picture that this may be these weren't big vaccination families. So anyways, go ahead, go on.
That's all right. Those records were not shown to me. That's all I'll say on that point. But spending some time outside before the school day starts, in some sort of engaged activity is good for the kids. Kids go to school at this school Monday through Thursday. The school day is from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's not a rigorous schedule at all. It allows for lots of free time for the kids to explore their hobbies, which each of them kind of had in abundance. And so I think it was more environmental than it was the curriculum that's leading to that sort of the joy that I'm talking about.
Yeah. And it really sounds like a cousin of homeschooling, right? It's
Totally.
I mean, we've heard about this for a long time, hybrid homeschooling, these homeschooling co-ops that, most homeschooling families figure out quickly that they want their kids to be around other kids for at least part of the day or part of the week. And this is now maybe formalizing it a tiny bit and having the public, pay for it.
Yes.
But the same spirit, the same sense of kids learning on their own schedule. David, what questions do you have as a former teacher, maybe, or just as David?
Actually, it's mostly as a former student at a pretty small school. I didn't attend what I think would be classified as a micro school today. I attended a elementary and middle school where there were 13 kids in my graduating class, and there were goats. There
Were
were
you vaccinated, David?
well, I was, but I can't speak for, all of Greater Portland. Yeah, I mean, in some ways not related, right? In some ways it was different, right? It was not religious. I think it was more traditional, right? I guess my first question is, we're using this term micro school, but we covered a study just kind of um, the other last week, I think it was, where we were talking about kind of the most definitive survey of private schools in America. And one of the big takeaways was descriptive, right? Which is like your average private school is actually quite small, and pretty cheap, like $5,000 per kid, right? It's not some
Mhm.
$100,000 experience, and it could very well be somewhere with goats or chickens. And so I guess I'm just curious to know if you think like is this actually what is there an actually a meaningful line between micro school and private school, and if so, what is the distinction, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, probably not. There probably isn't if you look at it from a numbers standpoint of,
Yeah.
if the average private school is somewhere in the range of a graduating class of a dozen or so kids. I don't know if that's what you're saying, but is smaller and has these sort of uh has traces of what we think of as homeschooling type activities, whether it's goats or chickens or what have you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't think there probably is a meaningful distinction, except that in practice, micro schools seem to me to have um, there's more involvement from the families in terms of not just showing up for events, but like quite literally working at the school. Moms will be employed by the school, um, and in the case of Refresh, where I was teaching, of the teachers, I want to say 4 out of 5 of them were mothers of students in the school. Um, and then I think the degree to which these are unregulated and sort of unaccredited, as the big term, both in terms of the curriculum being unaccredited most of the time, and also the teachers not having gone to school for education, in some cases not having gone to college at all. That to me stands out. And I think micro schools get away with that more because the student body seems to grow more from word of mouth than it does from people, searching for top schools in my area on niche or whatever. They're not going to pop up there. Whereas a
Yeah.
private school, to me, typically it would. That doesn't really answer your question, I'm sure.
No,
But
no, it
those
did.
are the appreciable differences I can tell.
It did. And, I feel like you probably covered this in the piece, but can you just help our listeners and remind me? I mean, where do you think these kids are coming from? Are these kids who would have gone to public school or they would have been, homeschooled before that, they had sort of had some financial support for their homeschooling endeavor? Like, what should we think of as the counterfactual here?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. This was the other reason why I wanted to teach at Refresh. The families at Refresh are, by socioeconomic status, I'm not sure if, by the census standards, they're considered working class, but they are not upper middle class. These were solidly middle class to lower middle income families who otherwise their children certainly would not be at a fancy private school. And I doubt even at a $5,000 price tag would be doable for these families. I'm saying without ESA. The kids I taught 8 of them. A quarter had previously been in a military school. They were military kids. Uh, Two had been in public school. Two had been in a private Christian school, and two had been homeschooled. So we had like that much range between
Yeah.
all of them. So yes, but I would say the majority of kids at these sorts of micro schools are those who would ordinarily either be homeschooled or in a public school, purely from an affordability standpoint. And that to me that's the real sort of massive paradigm shift we're seeing in education today, right? That ESA opens up is the opportunity for quote private education for
Mhm.
families that are below, say, middle
Yeah,
income.
and so I want to think about this other example, this other contrast, which is with charter schools. As I told you earlier, my first love, right? We've been having a debate on the show recently about whether it is true that the charter school sector has become more and more like the traditional public school sector, and that it's become more regulation or more risk averse. The authorizers aren't willing to take a chance. And so you think, okay, could you imagine this school being a charter school? Now,
Mhm.
set aside the religious issue for a moment. The Supreme Court came close to opening the door to that, but not quite. Okay, but otherwise, could this exist as a charter school, or would it have a hard time? I mean, they'd have to take the tests. Maybe, I don't know, I can't remember in Arizona if the teachers have to be certified. They probably would have to be college educated. There's going to be some more oversight. I mean, does this school exist if it's just still in Arizona where, charter schools are allowed, but not ESAs?
I wish I could speak definitively to that. I taught at a charter school in Arizona. That was my first full-time teaching job. Was at a Great Hearts School, and it's their one Title I campus that they have in Phoenix. And I know
Interesting.
just from that experience, that we certainly had to have had a degree. We didn't have to have teacher certifications, which is a draw for those of us who didn't go to school for teaching but wanted to teach. I think I don't know, how small can a charter school be? I guess that would be my biggest
Yeah.
question. Can there be a charter school of 30 students? If so, they would need to change their curriculum because their curriculum's unaccredited. And I assume they would have to abide by some sort of testing standards, which,
Yeah.
as I talk about later in the piece, and as I assume we'll talk about, are things I just think are need those are policies that are needed to be put in place, I think, in Arizona to bring it out of the total wild west of unregulated education.
Right, right. No, that's interesting. And look, and the truth is, it is very hard to run a charter school that is that small. Most places, I think authorizers or people that's, philanthropists know you got to have, a couple hundred, 400 maybe kids to really make it work financially in most places, when you're doing things like trying to be competitive on teacher salaries
Sure.
and have, reasonably sized classes, then it's tough. A place like this, where again, it's unusual, it's so small, I don't know what those moms that were teaching there were making and how that worked, right? So maybe there's ways to make the finances work. And I mean, maybe I'll answer my own question. I mean, maybe the truth is, yeah, this school would not exist in this form were it not for ESAs. Now, could we ratchet up the oversight and transparency, maybe not all the way to the charter school level, but at least a little bit, right? Like,
Hmm.
okay, you pick the test school, but you got to have the kids take something once a year, and you got to assure us that they're showing up to class, on a regular basis. I don't know, some very basic things.
Yeah. On that teacher salary point, I do have a question about that because, big time ESA advocates in Arizona would say, uh, well, sure, you could have competitive teacher salaries because we're giving the families 90% of what we would otherwise spend to seat them in public school.
Mhm.
So I guess the rate, of course, would be 10% lower, but it's not that it's outrageously lower.
Yeah.
Why couldn't you have a school of 30 students with two teachers? Each has a class of 15. That's smaller than the
Mhm.
state average for a class to begin with. Each of those kids is worth 7 grand. Well, for this thought experiment, is worth $7,000 a head. That's $105,000 you're bringing in per
Mhm.
unit student classroom. You're doing it in your house. You got two rooms, big enough to hold
Yep.
15 kids. Suddenly, a teacher is looking at a six-figure salary with a
Mhm.
15 student classroom. Like these are the way people talk about that. I would be curious as to
Yeah.
why financial feasibility
Mhm.
is is for you one of the quick things you point to is to why this could be a
Yeah.
charter school.
Yeah, no, that's all interesting. And you're right. When you do those calculations, you do it for the public schools, you're like, oh my God, they're bringing in $300,000 per class. Where
Yeah.
the heck is the money going? And it's a good question. And some of it is, yes, the facilities. So if you're in a house instead of a other building, that saves money. Now, do you get approval for that? Is that going to be, in the charter sector? Do you have to get somebody to sign off on that? then you get the special ed stuff. Then you get, well, you got to have some administration and there's compliance and, on and on you go. And in the case of Arizona, I think it's fair to say that the traditional public schools have the most funding, and then the charter schools, and then the ESA is still pretty significantly below because it's not getting access to any of the local dollars. So, and certainly in most states, we have a paradigm where the private school choice is definitely getting a lot less money than charter schools, than traditional public schools. And so, which David has expressed concern over the time here on the show that, we're trying to, here we go again, we're trying to do education on the cheap. And we haven't, there's no new laws of the universe that say that just because it's private means that you can have dramatically greater productivity, especially if you need to recruit good teachers, right? And pay them a decent amount of money. All right, last thing, Chandler, when we got to get going, but what would you want to leave this Policy Wonk audience with? What do you want them to know about what you saw happening there in Arizona?
Well, I think that what my story captures that I hope is new, or at least fresh in this sort of discourse, is the student's perspective on what they want school to be like. I felt that the gap I could fill in education journalism was to give the kids the space that a big magazine like Harper's can afford a writer to, in turn, as much space as I could to the kids to talk. And so if you read my piece, you're going to hear the kids talk quite a bit. You'll see them in the classroom. You'll hear their thoughts on whatever it is that we're learning in class that day at length. And at the end of the piece, I had the kids write to me what sort of school they would like to be enrolled in if they could choose. And I knew that it would be tricky to ask this question out loud because we would have teachers and parents sometimes sit in on our class. I thought they're not going to answer truthfully. So I gave the kids a pop quiz in our last class, and I embedded in that pop quiz some questions about the school that I was teaching at and about what they would change. And if they could, what school would they want to go to next year? And I'll leave it on a cliffhanger. I want you to read the piece and see what the kids say. But I think there is something in there for no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on this issue that will surprise you. What kids who identify as Christians and Christian students think about being at a Christian school. What those sorts of kids who like to work best with their hands think about being at a school that has a workshop. And yeah, so I leave you with I suppose with homework, so which is to hear what those kids are saying and to reflect on policies through their eyes too.
Wonderful. Chandler Fritz, do your homework and go read his article in Harper's Magazine. Chandler, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
All right, now it's time for everyone's favorite, Adam's Research Minute. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back.
Now, people that are watching this on YouTube, they're going to see a little secret of ours. They're going to be like, what happened? David Griffith, it looks very different than he did just a minute ago. When it is true, people, sometimes we don't record our interviews and do the Research Minute on the same day. I went out of my way to wear the same shirt today, just to make it look like we could, But David, people are going to notice that you're looking unusually snazzy.
We don't know that it's a different day, Mike. It could be like a concert, right? It could be an outfit change. Wardrobe.
Oh, an outfit change. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is like Lady Gaga rips off the thing and has the suit under it.
Right.
It may be the case that we don't get to see you in a suit very often, David. It looks very sharp. You're looking good.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll try not to take that as an insult, Mike.
Yes. And David is going to get to see Amber, who is making the rounds with some listening tours about IES. So maybe you'll be able to report back next week on what you hear, unless it's all confidential still.
We'll see.
We'll see. Okay. Well, speaking of news, Adam, you've got some news on your own. I think some of our listeners may have seen this on LinkedIn, but if not, go ahead and break it to everybody that you are heading off to an exciting new opportunity.
Yeah. Next month, I'm going to be taking my talents to Tulsa and working out of a Tulsa office for the University of Oklahoma, where I'll be helping to lead a new policy center at the University of Oklahoma called the Oklahoma Center for Education Policy. So very excited
Yeah.
about that. Be working with Professor Dan Hamlin, who some of the listeners may know, runs a great innovation conference at Harvard every year. I think it's maybe this week. So I think he's
Yeah, happening
maybe,
right now.
maybe
Yeah.
out there right now. But yeah, we're looking forward to try and do some work here in Oklahoma. It's my home state. I'm very excited to try to move the needle here.
Yeah, well, you and Dan are going to make quite a powerful team, and it is exciting. It seems like there's quite a few of these types of research centers now around the country, and kind of university based but state focused. It's great. But man, we are going to miss you, Adam. You have been a
Miss
part of
y'all
our
too.
research team. Yeah, it's been what, 8 years, I think we figured
hmm
out, and it's about the same time for you too, right, David? That you've been.
It's working on 11 years now, Mike.
Oh my gosh, 11.
Yeah,
Totally.
yeah, we're all really old.
I'm going to miss. So, but here's the point, people. We do not have turnover very much at Fordham. We're lucky for that, including on a research team. So that's 8 years with David, Adam, and Amber. We are going to be hiring somebody new for our research team. So that is available on our website. It is, again, something only happens maybe once a decade. So let your friends and family know if they are a promising researcher who really cares about education policy. But Adam, we're lucky we got you for another, almost a month. And so people will get to hear the dulcet tones of your voice until you head off to Oklahoma. So what you got for us this week?
All right. Well, today on Adam's Research Minute, as long as it lasts, I've got a study highlighting a paradox relating to education resources. That is that just because you get more money, so you have more financial resources, doesn't mean that you get better classroom resources in a school necessarily. The study comes from California, where researchers at the Public Policy Institute of California show that while their state has poured a ton of money into K-12 over the past decade or so, classrooms aren't consistently seeing the staffing gains that you might expect. Spending is up, but the classroom inputs, such as equitable access to qualified teachers, not so much. For this study, the researchers stitched together statewide public data from the California Department of Education and related sources and followed districts and schools over roughly 2 decades, focusing on the post-2012 LCFF era through 2024, with some series starting in the early 2000s. Now, when I say post-LCFF, I mean the years after California rolled out the local control funding formula. That's LCFF, starting in 2013. The LCFF replaced dozens of older programs with a simple base grant plus extra dollars tied to each district's share of low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. And it gave districts far more spending flexibility. So post-LCFF covers the time period starting with the phase-in through the late 2010s and the period after full implementation, including the pandemic stimulus years. The study examines district-level finances and staffing, including salaries and school-level teacher metrics, such as teacher experience, credentials, and student-to-teacher ratios. What they find is, first, that school spending surged. Inflation-adjusted spending per student climbed dramatically after 2012 and again with pandemic relief. In 2013, California was spending about $12,000 per student. All these figures are going to be in inflation-adjusted 2024 dollars, by the way. By 2020, that had grown to almost $16,000 per student. Then the pandemic stimulus kicked in, and by 2024, spending had jumped again to around $21,000 per student. Remember, just 11 years earlier, it was $12,000. Of course, as pandemic era funding recedes, that is probably going to fall. So where did all that money go? Most of the new money went to staff and faculty salaries and benefits, but Interestingly, teacher salaries barely budged, with a few exceptions. Instead, instructional salary spending, teachers, and other classroom roles is a smaller slice of the pie than it was 20 years ago. In contrast, employee benefits and increased non instructional staffing gobbled up most of those funding increases. The study zooms in to examine the effects of the 2013 LCFF, that funding reform, which was meant to make funding more progressive. And it finds that as a result of that reform, high need districts did, in fact, get even bigger funding boosts than other districts. But on the staffing side, the results are pretty mixed for the higher needs districts. The share of fully credentialed teachers ticked up a bit, which is good. The highest need districts saw the teaching force become very slightly more experienced, which could also be good news. But student to teacher ratios didn't change in any of the types of districts they looked at, and the share of novice teachers rose across the board. Overall, more money didn't straightforwardly translate into smaller classes or a significantly more experienced workforce in districts where need is highest. Again, the additional money was going towards benefits and increases in non-instructional staff, and those patterns were even more pronounced in the higher needs districts than in other districts. After the LCFF, average teacher salary growth did outpace inflation. And that's especially true at the top of the scale, the teachers who were already earning more. But starting salaries, which is what matters for recruiting new teachers, are roughly where they were in the early 2000s after adjusting for inflation. Meanwhile, college-educated peers in other fields pulled further ahead. They give some indications of teacher quality, although I'm not sure that we'll trust all of these proxies. But statewide, most California students are taught by fully credentialed teachers with at least 3 years of experience. The wrinkle is what they call clear assignment, being both credentialed and authorized for the exact subject and student population that you're teaching. That share is lower than the credential rate, and it's where the cracks start to show. And I'll end with this. Math and science are notably harder to staff correctly. 1 in 10 secondary students attends a school where fewer than half of the math or science teachers are in clear assignments. And that's even worse in the neediest schools.
Oh boy, whew, a lot to unpack here. And this is an issue that, as listeners know, I am obsessed with recently, which is that it's basic labor economics, right? If you want to attract more great people to the highest need schools, we're going to need to pay them competitive salaries, which means competitive with where else they might go, like the affluent suburbs, as well as other fields. And so you would hope that when the high poverty districts get this influx of money, that at least some of it would end up going towards boosting teacher pay, especially at the front end of the scale, and that's not happening. And so, part of the question is why. Now, the wrinkle here, Adam, is that they are including the COVID era money. Now, in that case, I get that it's tricky maybe to put that money into the salary schedule because they knew it was going to go away, right? So it wasn't crazy maybe to have a strategy there where it was like, all right, we're going to try to spend that money on things that are sort of short-term expenses. We're going to have a bunch of tutors that we'll hire, and we know we've only got them for 3 years, or we're going to do some things to pay down our pension debt, or we're going to do some things on the HVAC, right? That I get, but everything that happened before that, kind of back in the 2010s, I mean, that was a change to the funding formula. That was basically permanent. You would hope some of that money's would go into salaries, and this is where you say this is a super strong union state in California. Aren't the teachers' unions, don't they care about teacher pay? It seems like maybe the answer is no. Maybe they would rather have more bodies. It is the case that teachers' unions, they get their fees based on the number of members. I think everybody pays a flat fee generally, not as a percentage of salaries. And so maybe the union's incentive is to get more bodies, plus make sure that people, the older members, more active in the union maybe, are the ones getting teacher pay raises when they happen. Is that too cynical, David?
I don't think it's too cynical. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly what I think is happening. I mean, is it fair to say that these funding increases are essentially just staving off reforms to pensions? I mean, is that kind of like they're kind of removing the natural need to restructure pensions that are maybe overly generous, or maybe not overly generous if California voters will just continue to pony up? I mean, is that where the money's going when we say benefits? Is that what we mean?
I think that's a part of the story. Yeah, David.
Okay.
But also healthcare, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like healthcare is sort of, in some ways, I don't know. I can't really begrudge teachers healthcare, right? I feel like there's healthcare inflation with or without unions. But it is kind of, it's weird to see how all these things stack on top of each other and produce numbers that feel a little ridiculous, right? I guess I'm also just wondering about these non-instructional staff. I mean, particularly before the pandemic. Yeah, I mean, I assume that tutors were probably classified as non-instructional staff. It's hard to say exactly how much of that accounts. Well, maybe I'm wrong. I guess that's what I'm wondering, Mike.
I mean, they do instruction. I mean, I don't know. That's a good question. And it's not like we don't see the. I mean, we've seen these patterns in a few other places too, I think. I mean, the basic disconnect here, that you get a whole bunch of money and none of it seems to go to boosting starting teacher salaries, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is an indictment, not only of these school districts, but also the notion that funding formula reform, right? Making funding formulas more progressive, which, hey, I'm on board with, even as somebody right of center. I get it. It costs more money to educate kids coming from poverty. But if the money just evaporates and doesn't even lead to higher teacher salaries for those early teachers, I mean, it starts to make you think like, we got to have a different strategy here. I mean, maybe we need to say the state policy has got to be, look, we're not going to just give you flexible money. We're going to force you to spend more of this money boosting teacher pay in high need schools.
Well, it's weird. A lot of people think that high needs districts are, experiencing these savage inequalities, that they're not getting any funding. We've got the Abbott Elementary and, all these kind of cultural ideas that like the high poverty places are not getting any funding. But that's just not true anymore. And it's especially not true in California, where they have really progressive funding. So there's money there to be able to do with it what the districts think will most boost student achievement. But it seems like they don't think that, or either they're not focused on student achievement, or they don't think that paying teachers more would do that. But I mean, to me, the most important classroom input that you can have is a high quality teacher. So why they're not using that money to help attract more of those teachers in, I just don't really understand.
By the way, it may be that Abbott Elementary picked the one city in the country that still has this problem, which is Philadelphia.
Could be
I
right.
think it is the case that Pennsylvania is now an outlier, as one of the only states that has not actually moved to a much more progressive funding formula. Maybe there's been some movement there. I can't remember. But okay, so yes, we should. Abbott Elementary. But no, you're right. I mean, the savage inequalities thing was real back in the 80s and early 90s. The picture looks very different now. But and again, maybe the argument is that, look, we need not just progressive funding, we need funding systems that are dramatically progressive. I mean, if you want to be able to spend, let's say, pay teachers in the highest need schools $10,000 or $20,000 more a year, which might be what it takes to get really good people to come teach in those schools. Yeah, like that's a lot of money. Right.
I mean, it's not really though, right? I mean, that's like less than $1,000 per student, right? I mean, if they have 20 students.
Okay. Well, I guess that's right. If the money was going towards that instead of being siphoned off for who knows what.
I mean, to me, the clearest indication that something is wrong is this business around math and science teachers, right? Like we all have our own bees in our bonnets, right? And that, I don't know. I mean, I don't disagree with you when it comes to starting pay, Mike. I do agree with you, but to me, it's just so obvious. If you have, I don't know if there's shortages, maybe that's too strong a word, but sort of shadow shortages. It sounds like in these areas where you're just kind of shoehorning people into these roles who maybe are not particularly good at algebra 2 or whatever. Right? I mean, nobody considers math a nice to have. It's a core critical top of the food chain function of the education system. So if we're experiencing something resembling shortages there, it tells me that we're not really prioritizing the things that people think should be prioritized, right? Like when it comes to other things, I can make a case for smaller class sizes or whatever, right? Or I don't know, counselors, but like nobody really thinks math is a nice to have. And so it's troubling that we aren't able to do something about that the system is so resistant to differentiation that it can't go out and throw some money at the problem and get some math teachers. Like, to me, that's a very basic test of, is the system working for kids?
All right, we will leave it there. Great discussion, guys. Really good stuff, Adam. Thanks for bringing it to us. I noticed, by the way, there's another one of those state-based think tanks, doing good work, just like you're going to do in Oklahoma. All right, well, that is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.